antibodies ever. You know, they make these sugars for you. I can't tell you when I understood this the first time, and Todd here in the middle said, well, we can make those sugars. Like, how much do you need? We can have the summer student make you 1 kilo next week. And you know, you could have knocked me down. But this is what transdisciplinary research does when you're in a university like the University of Calgary or the University of Edmonton. You can be exposed to all these amazing things that allow you to do stuff. So we did stuff. So they made the sugars for us. There's a long history in Alberta of sugar, of carbohydrate chemistry. Put a team together, they made the sugars for us, and we put them in our lab and we started sticking them to beads. Just like you do the Luminex test. Well, not exactly the same, because they are sugars, they're not exactly the same. But you can take these sugars, stick them onto the Luminex beads, which are all these different colors, and then you put your patient's serum onto the beads, and if there are antibodies there to each of the different sugar subtypes, they stick to them. And then you add a secondary antibody, and your machine spits out a profile that looks a lot like what we saw. This, I'll show you some more here. It's very similar to what I showed you for HLA antibody testing. So this is brand new stuff. This is like brand new stuff. So we're just learning a lot about this. We had to show that the coupling could be standardized. We want this to be standardized. So their A and B is the same. We send it out to our friends around the world to see if we send them a serum sample and we send them the beads, can they do the test in their HLA laboratory? So we sent it to 9 other labs around the world, and there was good concordance between the results in every lab because you can't change the Luminex machine. So it's just as we hoped it would be. There was good concordance and reproducibility. And now we're starting to generate the profiles like I showed you in the very beginning for HLA. This is kind of what they look like. The difference between this and the HLA is that we now are giving you IgM and IgG. So it's easy to tell the difference between those two different flavors of antibodies because they're both important. This is an ABO individual. You can see they've got high levels of IgG antibodies. They've got IgM antibodies to all these different sugars, the subtypes that I've given you here. I've got the A and the B sugars here. This is magic. You know, we couldn't do this before. Is it helpful? Well, we think so. I'll show you an example. This is a B individual, and so we're starting to see some things that don't quite make sense. Why does this B individual have an anti-B3? Well, we've never been able to test that before, so we don't know yet. So not all of this new knowledge is going to be understandable to us yet, but it's opening a lot of scientific pathways that are going to be very helpful, we think. We're starting to understand that ABO, blood group O individuals have a wide range of antibodies. We kind of knew that by agglutination, but now we'll be able to understand it a little bit better. And it may be that the IgG is really the story, and we're beginning to see that unlike blood group B people, blood group O people produce much more IgG, anti-A, for example. This is all a work in progress. I'm not going to bore you with, like saying I know what this means yet. I just know there's a lot of new information here. And this is the main one. The titer doesn't mean anything. Look at these titers here across the bottom. And look at these levels of antibody here. You could just put one on top of the other. And yet we're making clinical decisions based on this test here, when there's all this IgG subtype, this IgG isotype antibody there that we're not even detecting. How does this matter clinically? Let's look at one example. We have a colleague in Paris who had a patient who had a blood group B to O kidney transplant and had high-breaking rejection in the operating room. Big surprise because the titer was low. It was 1 and 2 without an enhancement, and was 1 and 8 with an enhancement. Most surgeons would say, that's acceptable, I feel comfortable going into the operating room. And there was a catastrophe. So they sent us the same sample. And this is what we found. We found a lot, what you can see in the teal color here, of IgG antibody that had been undetected by their isohemagglutinin test, by their agglutination assay, and especially this one. I told you that the glycan number 2 was the most important one. And look at, there's a huge amount of antibody to that glycan in this graft, and this probably explains the clinical scenario. And that was undetected by our standard test. And so I think I'm just going to move on a little bit. So we're able to now uncover things that we think are going to make a difference. It's going to take a long time, so they're going to help us understand risk assessment. And just a couple of examples, are there different risks for an ABO-incompatible transplant if the IgG is higher than the IgM? Do we need different immunosuppressive strategies? If the A is the mismatch on the B, instead of lumping them all together, do we need to consider them separately? If the specificities were against the A2 versus against the other subtype specificities. So the nuances that we take for granted in histocompatibility should now be available for us to study. And we think that this will be a big step forward. So the take-home message here for this is that the standard methodology, which is an indirect measurement of ABO antibodies, really doesn't provide the information that we need. And to assess the risk so that we can move forward and offer transplantation, which is a very successful therapy for more and more patients, especially those that are disadvantaged by the blood group that they have. And that we need standardized assays for direct measurement of these antibodies that will allow us to do better risk assessment. You've all probably seen the news that's happened in the last 2 years about xenotransplantation. Pig organs are becoming a reality, and although the 2 heart cases have shown us that there's still more work to do, the work that's being done in kidney transplant is really very exciting. These are also sugar structures that we have antibodies to. So this kind of technology and thinking about histocompatibility in terms of not just HLA, we think is going to be very important. So I had this little rant. I stayed awake at night and I thought, why is it this way? When we talk about HLA issues in organ transplantation, the technology is highly sophisticated, it's standardized globally, the clinical decisions are driven by an expanding science, and it's expanding all the time. It's hard to keep up with HLA science. Organ allocation isn't regulated according to HLA disparity. The transplant programs undertake those decisions. And risk is accepted because it's transplantation. It's that field. And it's assessed working together with our teams. And it's an amazingly collaborative field that's globally collaborative. In contrast, my rant here, ABO issues are managed entirely differently, even though they're also histocompatibility, or should be. The technology is rudimentary. It lacks consideration for transplantation. The clinical decisions are made on a whole bunch of assumptions that have been in place for a century and are largely not true. It's not driven by science. It should not be part of organ allocation, should not be based on this, and yet it is, and it's very, very difficult to change the way you think about this. I'm discovering. I thought, when I was young, you could publish something and it would be like, oh, that's kind of fun. Let's change how we do things. But this is turning out to be a really, really entrenched view. And we need the science to really address it. And we need to think about this, I think, in the risk is still extrapolated from transfusion, which is really no risk is acceptable. So we need a new framework. And so I took out the one where I'm kind of doing this because I thought it might be insulting to our transfusion colleagues, which is not my intent, really. So, I've kind of hammered this point home, but I think that the tools, and since I think we have just a few extra minutes, I think that the tools that we use that come from science that we pursue across disciplines, and transplantation is really, I think, a good example of that. And I think Todd, you said that at the very beginning. It brings together different organs. It brings together different kinds of science. It brings together people who are at the clinical facing the clinical frontiers, but also who are involved in the social sciences, philosophy, economics, art even, as well as the spectrum of those who are in the really hard sciences like carbohydrate chemistry, computing technology, artificial intelligence and machine learning, as we hear about. And it brings them together into this kind of focus that covers every aspect of science and technology, whether it's clinical or basic or social. And I think that's one of the most attractive things about transplantation and donation. And to you learners there, I think that I hope can provide you some really stimulating ideas to think about as you think about your career in science. And I think I'm just going to leave it there with some acknowledgments to the amazing people who do this work in my lab, as well as our collaborators around the country and around the world. The Canadian Donation and Transplantation Program has embraced this idea that not only do we need to collaborate across science and embed fundamental basic research in our in transplantation and in our collaborative networks, but that we need to work across the organ systems and these many areas of science. And so I welcome you to join the CDTRP. Go to cdtrp.ca. There's a lot going on. We especially welcome our wonderful patient partners and members of the public and the community who have a connection to donation and transplantation. There's a lot to be done in this field, and we need all of your help to do it. And again, the people who carry out these tests in my lab, I'll just leave up here because they're the superstars of this particular field. So thank you very much for your attention.
So we do have time for questions, for discussion, for, again, we will be having a reception following this as well. We're just getting set up now. But if anybody has any questions or would like to make some comments, please feel free.
Well, it sounds like you're in a situation where, much like rural practice, medicine, changing the average intellectual mind to adopt it's usually a 2-year cycle. Studies as well.
I'd like everybody to hear your... You're starting over. It's a great comment, so I want everyone to hear it.
So I was just saying that the average time for a clinician, a scientist, someone who's very intellectually involved in a field of endeavor, to change their mind about how things go, at least according to the sociologists and psychologists who studied this, is around 2 years. So you can introduce a new, safe, pharmaceutical alternative into the medical area that you're talking about, and you can go back 2 years later and they're still lingering on making the change to something safer and better. So it sounds like if we took the evidence that's available in how you change behavior in the wall that you're running into in this ABO transfusion versus transplant medicine, we might help the headway.
How should we do that?
With intention. It's not going to happen as we roll out the marvelous information that you presented today. I have a blood issue, and so I think I'm more than the average clinician. I know some hematology, but boy, I learned a heck of a lot more today, and I can see why it will take some time for this to gravitate into the laboratories and practitioners' hands. But if alongside and parallel to the issues of putting the science forward, you study the methods that will change their minds sooner.
Yeah, that's a really good point, is how do you change minds? You know, it's obviously not as easy as just publishing something. It's almost harder because there is this other field, and the advances in transfusion have been so amazing over the past century. So it's really harder, and there have been some very high-profile mistakes. You know, there have been some errors made in which an ABO incompatible transplant has been done mistakenly. And of course, if you're not prepared for it, especially for a heart or lung transplant, where you're actively giving blood products containing the antibodies you're trying to avoid, is going to make it even worse. So it's understandable. But you're right, maybe we need to focus some of our studies on how to invoke change when good science isn't quite enough, because you have, I think one of the most amazing, for me as a clinician, I thought I knew kind of a little bit, you kind of don't know, but you're given information as a clinician. Here's the sodium, here's the potassium, here's the anti-A titer. Like, you think you can rely on it. And really, you might be able to learn about the sodium and how it's done and how it's measured, and the potassium. But I knew as a clinician when I first embarked on this ABO journey, I thought I knew what a titer of 1 in 16 was. We know nothing as clinicians about titers. Even those of us who do a lot of work with blood, we often don't know what method our lab uses. We don't even know what method they use because it just isn't as forthcoming. You have to dig for it a little bit. And you go to your blood bank and you talk to them about it and say, well, what method do we use here? And they'll say, well, we use the tube method at 37 degrees. But when you meet with other clinicians and you ask them, Greg, do you know how titers are done in your lab? Oh, I don't know. Exactly. I don't know exactly, but I think I know what to do with this result. That was a real eye-opener for me when I realized I knew nothing about this technology. And I think in medical schools, I don't know that we teach it very well, except to our transfusion medicine people, but they're not transplanters, they're transfusion people. And I still am amazed by that, because UNOS, the United Network for Organ Sharing in the United States, that's in charge of transplantation, they've recently loosened the regulations by which a child can be considered for an ABO-incompatible transplant, and they've kind of left it up to the centers, which I think is, in some ways, for a very bureaucratic organization like UNOS, a big step forward. But they've left them with a titer that they have to go by, which is meaningless when you don't know anything about the method. So a clinician, all across the country are going to say, well, 1 in 16, they said it was okay, it's going to be safe, and that's going to be a disaster. So I just think it's a really interesting thing that we can't hang our hats on it, and as clinicians, we're not taught more about it, and how these biologic tests, and cellular tests, and antibody tests are different from chemical tests. And anybody in transplant knows that, because we deal with our HLA colleagues all the time, the concept of it. But for blood group stuff, it's just kind of risk avoidance, not risk management. I'm sorry, that was another little rant. I'm sorry about that.
Hi, Dr. West. Thanks for coming in general, and thanks for fielding my questions at lunchtime. I guess I'm listening to this and I'm wondering, what is the current landscape? Forgive me, everyone, I'm a trainee, so forgive me, but what is the current landscape of interactions between the transplant community and transfusion medicine teams? And then a follow-up would be, what opportunities are there for collaboration on a regular basis so that this technology interpretation and working groups, perhaps, are currently happening?
I need to get my steps in after so many hours on a plane.
So that's a great question, and of course that's what we seek to encourage, is ways that we can exchange information in better ways, more appropriate ways. And there are a number of international agencies that we're beginning to work with. One of those is the International Society of Blood Transfusion. There's another one that I think will be more promising, which is where HLA lives, which is ASHI. So these professional societies that have the annual meetings, and we've been starting to knock on those doors and presenting the work and publishing the work. But you actually have to get in the working groups, as you suggested. You need to be around the table and actually convert the 6 people around the table who then go out and talk about it in a knowledgeable way the next group of people. But some of these international organizations that have worked so hard on ABO over the years, I think are going to be a way that we can advance the science in a practical way that will bring these things to the forefront. The trouble is that, and I kind of glossed over this because I think it was getting a little complicated, but in the United States, blood banks still have to do phenotyping to be accredited, even though it has nothing to do in transplantation with the phenotype. You know, so there's all sorts of accreditation and standardization, and I think, as you were saying, Greg, too, it's not a small thing to change the rules. There's so many of them by which organizations become, medical organizations become practice and regulation and so on. So it's going to take all those interactions, I think.
So as a clinician and somebody who's been involved in heart transplantation for a long time, I really don't think that this kind of information is really out there. Again, we've been friends and colleagues for a long time, so I've been following what you've been doing, etc. But I think today was one of the first days that I've got it all sort of understand where you're coming from and what the opportunities are. So we also need to get the message out to those of us who are doing the clinical work as well, and get it out a little bit more broadly. And I know you've been working on that as well.
So for you, Deb, this is something being faced across transplantation more and more, and that's the issue of HLA sensitization. We have more and more higher risk patients who are more sensitized. In other words, they have more of them have antibodies to HLA, creating more barriers and higher risk transplants. So you've got a highly sensitized patient, and you might be considering desensitization for them with agents that are newly available that are becoming really almost cancer chemotherapy agents. They will ablate the entire immune system in an effort to get rid of HLA antibodies. They can address B cells, plasma cells, T cells, and in some cases we'll actually kind of write off a patient and say they are too highly sensitized for us to deal with, they cannot be transplanted. However, what hasn't been done is to look at the impact of those agents on ABO antibodies. We routinely look at what happens, our goal is to see how they affect HLA antibodies, but how many times have you sent a serum from those patients and asked, what are their ABO antibodies? It probably doesn't even occur to you, because it wouldn't. It's not considered. And yet, what we're beginning to start to look at is that the impact of these amazingly powerful drugs on ABO antibodies may allow even adult heart transplant patients an ABO incompatible, HLA compatible patient. In other words, it may create entire new opportunities for getting these patients transplanted, where in some settings we're saying they're not at all transplantable. But if we let our minds think about the possibility that ABO is not necessarily an insurmountable barrier, we may find opportunities. And I think for us in heart transplantation and in lung transplantation as well, being able to actually just order that test and say, well, it might be, we transplanted a 9-year-old last week who just happened not to have ABO antibodies and had been desensitized like that. So, I'm sort of thinking that if we're creative if we're together creative about looking for opportunities, but it goes back to the paradigm. You have to question the paradigm. I was a very young faculty member when I questioned the ABO paradigm. I can't believe now, looking back on it, that I was allowed to actually, that we did that. That we actually said, these children we had a very compelling patient population. These children will die without a transplant. They have not got the mediators of hybrid cure rejection. This will be safe, and it was safe. But to challenge the paradigm, and again, to the lawyers and to all of us out there who face these paradigms, you have to understand and ask, why is that paradigm there? We all have that responsibility, all of us. Sorry, it was another little rant. I love your rants.
That was terrific, Lori. Will the field of xenotransplantation accelerate the development of the area that you've been talking about?
Well, I think that we can help. So maybe yes, because the ability to use sugars to make sugars, to understand how sugars interact with the immune system is a rapidly growing area. In a lot of ways there are lots of things with COVID, for example, that come into play as well. So understanding carbohydrate, not chemistry necessarily, but the interactions with health and disease of polysaccharides, of sugars, I think is a really interesting and rapidly growing area. It really helps to have chemists who can make these things for you so you can ask questions. In the xenotransplant world, where for those of you who are not familiar with it, the things that are one of the biggest barriers between pig organs and humans is that pigs have these sugars on their cells that we don't have, and therefore we make antibodies to them. Again, these spontaneously produced antibodies. So the genetically modified pigs that are now being used that have like 10 different things knocked in or out get by those barriers a lot. But as we found out from the latest case in Maryland, which appears to have failed because of some kind of rejection response, there are still probably glycan-related, sugar-related immunologic differences that we don't have the tools to assess yet. So we're talking, we're working with those investigators who are more active in clinical xenotransplantation than I am, but we can make the tools, we can help with the tools. So I think it will help. It will help uncover what are the subtle differences that we made.
Any other comments? All right, so as you can see, first of all, this has been an amazing presentation. And I think for those of us involved in transplantation on all levels and our learners, this has been just so valuable. So thank you so much, Lori. I really appreciate it. I would like to announce as well that we do have a reception that will be starting in a few minutes. And the reception is going to be dedicated to our very close friend and colleague, the late Dr. Leanne Tibbles. It's a champagne reception because, as Leanne always said, that her substance of abuse of choice is champagne, and that this should be offered at this reception. So we will be having a toast to Leanne as well, and they are just setting up the bar and and all of the snacks, etc. So please just give us a couple of moments to get organized. But thank you again, Lori. Much appreciated. And Lori will be very happy, I'm sure, to take any questions or comments during the reception. So thank you very much.